This is a show about facing fear, unlocking courage, and taking action.
Courage isn't necessarily a daunting thing.
It's going to give you more purpose. It's going to give you more drive.
It feels like making a courageous decision is going to get you closer to who you aspire to be.
It's knowledge plus faith plus action equals courage.
Do something that impacts winning. Everyone isn't going to be the high scorer. Everyone isn't going to be the leading rebounder. Everyone isn't going to be the winner of all the awards or the CBI awards or whatever. But if you're part of the team, impact winning, however winning is defined in the situation that you're in.
Well, I would call this the flashback episode, but it's like the flash before your eyes episode, because like in a blink, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, how is it possible that now we're looking at 25, 30 years ago that I was walking the halls of 350 Hudson Street. And back then I could tell you that I didn't really have a clue how good I had it. Like I was surrounded by wild talent and at a time where advertising was a great place to be. And this is not foreshadowing to say advertising is a horrible place to be. I'm just saying back then it was a joy. And when I think about the learning ground that I had, I remember a very specific meeting in the CEO's office where right before I started, he looked at my portfolio, which was probably crap, but from my lens, it was good back then. And he said to me, and I'll try to do my best Ron Berger impression now, "You're going to get a PhD in advertising, if you come here." And man, you were so right. And I just got so lucky being able to jump in there and dance between different floors. If you haven't figured it out, my guest today is, good creative force. You're a legend, Ron. The things that you've done, maybe you don't love that open, but these are the facts. If you've studied Ron's work, not only was the CEO of Messner, Vetere, Berger, McNamee, Schmetter, say that 5 times fast, but just amazing stuff, time to make the donuts for Dunkin' Donuts. I was right there to watch you kind of lead the charge with the Subway pitch. Subway Eat Fresh was you. And before that, the journey has been so cool, just coming from Carl Alley, which was before my time, but meeting your partners, growing this agency, growing a real culture. So one, just thank you for always giving me opportunities to at least have a job. And then 2, I should say, I think mentorship it's hard when you're a kid to declare, I have a mentor, or I need a mentor, or I want a mentor. And when I think about my career, there's 2 mentors that I've had. One was Steve Wilhite, who you may remember Wilhite. He ran Volkswagen, then went out to Apple, reported to Steve Jobs, and the world just decided that we were both going to live in San Diego. And I think he was surprised that somebody actually gave a shit about advertising like me when we met. And then he counseled me. And then I would put you as by far the other mentor for me. And if it wasn't for, to be fair, I was long gone from Messner days. It was probably, if we both didn't love the word courage or the concept of courage, maybe that never happens. But I can remember the LinkedIn message I got from you. That's like, what is this thing you're doing with courage? And, here we are many years later where I've been supported by you, but also like leaned on you for counsel in the space. So one, great to see you. How you doing? Where are you these days?
What's great to be seen as the joke goes. I'm in my winter pitches and catches reported this week. So I'm down in the heart of spring training in South Florida in Palm Beach. So where they actually did open a terrific minor league stadium. They had one where the Cardinals and the Marlins trained in Jupiter, but they opened one called the Ballpark of the Palm Beaches about 2 years ago, where the Astros and your team, the Nationals. I don't know if they're your team, but they're your area team. But anyway, I'm in Florida. We spend a lot of time down here in the winter, and as well, a lot of friends have gotten older, even older than me, you start to gravitate down south. So that's where we are, and I appreciate and thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you. I have this expression that the reason cliches are true are cliches is because they're true, and the one about how fast time goes, and the older you get, the faster it seems to go, both personally and professionally. And when I think back, to people like you and came out of Ithaca and showed up on the doorstep as a number of people who went to school with Ryan and Corey over the years, and we took them in as as interns. And to think that was 25 years ago, and then there's the part about actually me starting in the mailroom of an agency as a summer job at Carl Alley, which is and that was simply a job that my mother knew the personnel manager of the agency at the time. There was no human resources. She was the personnel manager, and I had the only summer jobs I had prior had been, as a counselor or or a waiter at a camp, so I could play basketball. And I got this job as a summer mail boy, and I was living in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, taking the train. And because I was a good athlete, I wound up on the agency softball team. And next thing I know, I'm playing center field, and Jim Durfee, president of the agency, is playing first base, and Emil Gargano, the creative director of the agency, is playing shortstop. And we then did a combination team with Jerry Delafamini's agency. Meanwhile, I'm 18 years old, and I'm playing center field in a softball league in Central Park. And over the next few years, I start to, people start asking me, well, what are you doing? What are you doing for a living and everything? So I have no idea. They were, I was lucky enough to begin to put together, as you said, a portfolio, and even luckier to get my first job there as a junior copywriter in 1972. So a long time ago, but a story that, and people will say, what's the equivalent of starting in a mailroom today? And I said, I don't know what the equivalent is, but it's we all talk about journeys. That journey from Sheepshead Bay, taking the D train into Manhattan to 437 Madison Avenue. And every time I walk by that building, as I do often if I'm in the city, I look at it and think, how is this possible if this is where this whole thing started, I don't know, 55, 57 years ago? It's kind of crazy.
You had mentioned your mom. One of the questions I had for you growing up was, how tough were your parents? And the reason I bring that up, before mentor status, there was terrified of Ron Berger status for me, as a kid in an agency. Like, this is the courageous moment of the conversation for me, right? When you're just a kid, just trying to figure out the hallways and figure out how to survive. And again, I think I get why. I mean, if you didn't know Messner, if you were in the business, you clearly knew Messner. It was a 700-person agency. We were working on some of the best work there was. All I wanted was to get my hands on like a meaty brief, and was one of 100 people that wanted. Like, everyone was competitive, everyone was a lead, everyone wanted to win. But like, I remember you being strategic, thoughtful. You were playing chess always. There's another cliche, right? But also, you were intimidating. Like, you would be like, if we had to go present to you, like, I have no idea how the rest of my day is about to go, depending on if they're going to like this idea or not. So, one, that toughness, does that come from just the streets of Brooklyn? Were your parents tough on you? Did you have siblings?
I don't know the answer to the question. I mean, well, I know the answer isn't that it came from my parents. I was very fortunate. I mean, fortunate in a lot of ways. I grew up in a, very middle class, working class family. Never lived in a house. Lived in an apartment in Brooklyn my entire life. First house I ever lived in was the first house that Karen and I bought in 1975, or actually, 75, 76 or something. So, but in terms of an upbringing, my parents were tremendously supportive. I grew up in an unfortunate circumstance in the sense that my father had serious heart problems, and had his first heart attack when I was 12 years old. And I remember it was 1960. It was the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Yankee World Series, and he was in the hospital. It was in October, and it was the famous Bill Mazeroski hit the home run over the left field wall to beat the Yankees, and he wasn't allowed to watch the game because there was a sense that he might get too excited and it might cause a problem. So I was 12 years old at the time, and so I grew up with a father who, for the next 10 years, so let's basically from, let's say 12 to 21, 22, because he had a series of heart attacks over that period of time where there was always sort of eggshells, maybe too strong a word, but there was always this sort of sense that you need to be a normalcy as much in a house. And my mother worked, she worked at the advertising sales department, classified advertising sales at the New York Post. I had an older brother who passed away, about 6 or 7 years ago, who was very much like me earlier. He was a good athlete, but when my father got sick, my brother sort of paid the price for that. He had to drop out of college. He was going to Brooklyn College. And the reason I said, I think I said, I don't actually have the answer to the question of why I developed the way I did, because it was certainly not environmental. I mean, I could tell you that in the fourth grade, the parent-teacher conference, my mother used to tell a story where the teacher would say that she really wasn't in control of the class, that I was, that the kids would listen to me. And there was nothing. It wasn't like I grew up in a military family or, my father was Bobby Knight. There was no sense of that at all. In fact, they were tremendously supportive. And I was a decent student. I was a very good athlete. I played basketball in high school and, second team all city in New York, and, at a high level, and then wound up getting a basketball scholarship to the University of Hartford. But the point is that as an upbringing, it wasn't like you have to do this or you're going to do this and you failed. Not even anything close to that. So any sense that an environment that I grew up in would have contributed to a personality that, the way you described me is not something that I haven't heard before. I think that in a lot of ways, I sort of cultivated it. Tom Carroll used to have a line that I treated everybody as if they were assholes until proven otherwise. I think a lot of it is just the streets of Brooklyn kind of, not rough and tough, just, I don't want to make it sound like I grew up in it. You saw the movie I did about the guys in Brooklyn. It was a great upbringing, played a lot of sports. We were always hanging around, but, getting into little trouble here. But I always had an independent streak about me. And, in high school, when guys started to do drugs and drink beer, I had a girlfriend. And, when they got into trouble in the early 70s, which is, well documented in the movie, I had already left the city. I was on a basketball scholarship. My parents left Brooklyn. So my life, it wasn't like I scripted it. It just that's just the way it was. And I never had a problem at an early age being who I wanted to be. But as I said, I can't say that it was something that I looked at and thought, that's what I want to be. My early, you talk about mentors or whatever, my early ones were basketball. In fact, one of them just passed away a couple of weeks ago, Barry Kramer, who was played for NYU in mid-60s and wound up as a judge in Schenectady. They were athletes that I looked up to because I liked the way they played and I liked the way they handled themselves. So, I don't know whether that independent thing that I had and the self-confidence that I had, which I always had, again, why the combination of having had some big birthdays over the years, the last few years, you do at a certain point reflect and say, how did I get here? I don't mean, physically, but how do you wind up being the person that you are based on sort of the kind of questions you're getting at? Because oftentimes you'll say, okay, here's why, he went to a military academy, or he did this, or his father was a strict lawyer, or his mother was this, and therefore he did that. It was none of that. Absolutely none of that. Everything was completely circumstantial, except the fact that I clearly had a self-confidence in being good, that I was good at what I did. I was a good basketball. I was a good athlete. I was a decent student, and I felt comfortable being who I was, and I didn't really care much for what people tended to think one way or the other. And I think it probably then carried through, when I went to, it's why, at 18, 19 years old, as a summer mill boy, I was hanging around with, what turned out to be industry legends, and there was a comfort level that I didn't try to be something I wasn't, and they were sort of very comfortable having me around. And, so I think that's, it's a long answer, but I don't know if I've actually answered the question.
No, I mean, you can't help but think about I can't help but think about my own choices. And, in some ways I got like the Len Bias moment as a Maryland fan. I remember crying I was probably 12-ish. And I remember crying that morning. He's supposed to be the next Michael Jordan, as they all said, right? And I was like, whatever he did, whatever I'm out, like I will never do. Like that was a stained moment. And then, my girlfriends growing up were Mormon. Like you weren't getting very far. Like I love competing. Like that's what I love to do. I love being on a soccer field, being on a basketball court. For you also, I think it was baseball before, like you're a good baseball player before you ever got into basketball, right? And then I do think the leap from sports, which is so, like if you beat me, you deserve to beat me. I'm going to be prepared and I'm going to shake your hand if you beat me. And in some ways, advertising was the same way. Like if you beat me in a subjective pitch, this is clearly a long time ago, but like you beat me in that world, you deserve to beat me. Like as you got into it and you started like developing those skills, were you like, this is fun? This is like, I get to be competitive. Did you know right away that this was like, oh, I'm on to something. This is a good path for me?
Well, I think there was one path that led to the larger path, which is obviously having a business. But I think the starting path of becoming a copywriter was one that I didn't necessarily. I always was interested in writing, maybe being a sports writer, and only because I had been exposed to the industry through delivering mail to spending hours on the creative floor and sending ads out. I would work when they would bring the laminated ads into the mailroom. I would see them for Hertz and for Pan Am and for, and I'd read them and I'd say, gee, this is, these, so I sort of through assimilation. So the early path, which is as a creative person, I think I developed both a skill and a confidence. I always looked at myself as somebody who enjoyed business, and why I don't know. Again, my father did not. It wasn't like he was a CEO of a company. My mother worked, in a classified advertising department, but I had an appreciation for business early on and the role that advertising played, and without question, that came from the way Carl Alley and then Ali Gargano, with a stint at Scally McCabe Sloves in between, without question was the foundation of the way those agencies worked, all starting at Carl Alley, because Ed McCabe came out of there as well, as did Ralph Amorati and Marty Puris. So the original skill of, can you be a good creative person and learn and grow and do that? I was very fortunate. I worked, Jim Durfee, I worked for two Hall of Fame copywriters in my career. One was Jim Durfee, who hired me originally. And then after about 2.5 years, I got a call from Ed McCabe, who, said, this was, in the glory days of Scally McCabe, where, Purdue had just been done and for early Volvo. And he said to me, "Are you happy?" And I said, well, and I didn't know him. I thought it was actually a joke. I thought a friend of mine was playing a joke on me, that he was calling. And to make a long story short, he said to me, "I've been looking in these award books and everything I liked, you did." Now, this is 1975, 4 or 5, and I'm in the business 3 or 4 years, and I'm thinking, this is like, paid myself. I wasn't around with Babe Ruth. You would say, this is like Aaron Judge telling you, how to hit home runs. At that point, the line was, it was like Babe Ruth telling me how to hit home runs, kid. And I went to work for him, and he became the second Hall of Fame copywriter. And I think the combination of those individuals and a few others sort of sharpened what you were describing as sort of a focus and an understanding of strategy and the role that strategy plays in a creative platform, and then the ability to, there was those agencies didn't have any fat in their ideas. Ed was ruthless in a lot of ways, but one of them was in the discipline of cutting out all the extraneous stuff. And obviously, if you look at his work over the years, you could see that in every headline and every piece of body copy that he wrote. But he, when he offered me the job, he said, "Listen, I'm going to tell you this. At the end of every day, you're going to know whether you're the best copywriter in the industry or the agency or the worst." And I said, "How am I going to do that?" He says, "I'm going to tell you." And that was sort of how it was. And, and then 2 years later, and this is it goes back to, my self-confidence and independence. I got a call from actually Tom Messner, who was working at Ali Gargano, which was then Ali Gargano at that point, and said to me, we just won this county. You're interested in coming back? And what's interesting about Scally is nobody ever left there. And the reason they never left there because Ed had convinced them that there would be garbage. The only reason they were any good is because they worked for him. And I went in and I said, I'm leaving. He says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Ali." He said, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "Well, because, they called, they hired, and he said, "Well, you're making a mistake, and he said, "Whatever account you want to work." I said, "No, Ed, I think it's time for you to go." And nobody had ever done that before. And, he had some tremendously talented people there. So that, again, these are all sort of signs that the early thing that I always felt about myself. And, you touched on sports, which, is, and its relationship to my view of how business works and how our agency in particular worked, and how it was so much more like a basketball team with 5 partners and et cetera, and a very deep bench, which, is probably a whole podcast by itself. But anyway, that those early bosses, probably more than mentors, although they were, incredible teachers of the discipline of copywriting, and the agency's cultures were such that the role that a strategy that defined the brand and a platform that differentiated it, and then the work that actually delivered on that was foundational. There was no, oh, let's let's do something cool. Let's just do something to win awards. All that was a byproduct of the incredible discipline that the way the agency worked. And we also worked on very big, important brands at early ages, like Dunkin' Donuts. I was 27 years old or something, I think, when I did Time to Make Donuts. And I think that, because Tom and Barry and I all came out of Ali Gargano and Bob Schmetter came out of Scally, that was, again, it's not like we sat down and said, what kind of agency we want to have. We had no other choice. It was the only way we knew about how an agency should be.
First of all, if you give me 7 minutes, I can drive to the water right now. I bet you I know exactly where McCabe is. We can get him here on the phone here. He's here in San Diego.
No, I know. I've heard that. I've heard that.
I've had a big shout out to Christina Love too, because I know she keeps in touch with him, and I've had a chance to meet him before. I could see the discipline. No, I could see the starting 5, and I'll give you another. I was probably too young to realize it the first time around. Is you show up at 22, 23, but the other big lesson I really remember. I mean, the biggest lesson I remember was your eye for talent. Like, everyone who was there was good. Like really good. You could not learn from people there. If you were paying attention, you were going to learn from people. But the other big thing I remembered early was, and in my head, I hear you saying it, by the way, so I'm doing, there goes the Berger impression again, but I'm like, you always used to say, you're not in creative, you're in creative business. And there's a big difference between those two worlds. And you guys, even if you remember, for a while you had, I think they were called the CBAs, the Creative Business Awards.
Right. Well, actually, it started out. It was a creative. When we do a 1-page strategy document for a client, we didn't. When we got to the position, it was called a creative business idea.
That's CBIs. Yeah.
And then we wound up on a network level, EuroRCG, implementing the Creative Business Awards, which recognized the best CBIs from agencies around the world that were part of the network. But it was a very different, and to this day, now when people talk about, oh, it's not about commercials, it's about ideas, that's exactly what that was about 20 years ago. It was a creative business platform that allowed whatever, whether it was advertising, whether it was activation, whether, early days of word of mouth marketing, whatever it was, we never said, oh, here's the advertising platform, here's the advertising strategy. It was always this larger idea about a creative business idea that's purpose was to drive a brand's business, not just create great advertising.
I mean, I'm tiptoeing close to 50 here, and I still, just so you know, that still works for me. It's still, in fact, for being the Courageous podcast, the amount of times I've said in a meeting or in a keynote, I wish more business leaders understood the power of creativity, and I wish more creatives could realize that they don't need to be starving artists. And I'm using, it's like, no, what's the business applications to it? To me, that's still the secret weapon. It's still helping business people see. Now, it takes courage usually to have the conversation. It takes courage to invest in that idea. It takes courage to for them on the other side to acknowledge that maybe there's another way. But the way C-suites seem to be set up right now, it's very hard to be creative. You got a CFO and a chief data officer and a chief tech officer and a CIO, and it's somewhere down at the end of the table is one person responsible for brand or marketing, and even marketing is performance marketing. So very hard today for creativity to
one of the questions that sort of get at times is could you do today what we did 30 years ago? And part of me thinks, why not? Because I look at the work that we did, and there's nothing about it that is dated, or there's nothing about the ideas that are dated. In fact, in the last 6 months, there's been a whole thing around some Volvo. Volvo went back to the line for life as a global tagline. We did that line 20 years ago. And, they've gone back to, sort of the emotional advertising that we started in 1993. The end benefit of safety is saving people's lives, not just building safe cars. But having said that, I think clearly one of the big differences and why this is the case, I don't know. I mean, I have some thoughts on it, is one of the key things in my success, both as a creative talent, as an agency founder and CEO and leader, is my ability to sit down with the CEO of companies. And it was true of Tom and Barry as well. But I can only speak for myself and say that they saw, sitting down with Chuck Schwab or sitting down with Andy Grove, sitting down in, any CEO's office, they were used to either hearing from business account management people who were sort of trying to, quote, sell them something, or creative people who were trying to tell them that they should do this campaign because it was really a great campaign and it would be really interesting and cool and win awards. And, I always sort of came to the table with I think my style has always been, I don't think anyone ever felt like I was bullshitting them when I would say something. There was whether I was right or was wrong, I was telling them what I thought. And I think that they trusted that. And they trusted that if I was telling them that this was an idea that was worth doing and thinking about, and it was because we had done the work to make sure that it reflected their business situation, a strategy, and an assessment of the marketplace that would suggest there was an opportunity to achieve a certain objective if we executed this well. And I wasn't there trying to sell them a campaign. I was trying to tell them that we had done the work to then make the idea that we're presenting something really worthwhile considering. I always felt, I used to have this line that, one of my jobs was to make people feel comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because every client says, oh, you're making a client feel uncomfortable. It's too risky. And, to me, there was always a difference between risk and risky. This goes a lot to the courage. If you're not going to take a risk, then forget it. There's, nothing likely interesting is going to happen. If you're not uncomfortable, if everything you're seeing being shown is in your comfort zone, then the work is not pushing you to a point where you have to sort of feel a little bit uncomfortable. I think we did that really, really well. But again, because it was always grounded in almost an unassailable strategic understanding and definition with the brand and the opportunity, the work became a much easier thing to understand and discuss and digest, as opposed to, here's your situation, and we've got this really incredibly creative idea we really think you should do. That's a problem. That's a problem.
I mean, just hearing you talk, it's like don't even focus on the idea yet. Let's get to the root of the strategy. And so I know you guys were a huge sports family. You've always been a sports guy. The family's rooted in sports. Let's say there's like a weekend you were home growing up and Ryan's there and Corey's there and your wife's there. Like, did you guys ever play board games? Did you have a board game that you played as a family and did you just crush everybody? Like, give me the details there.
No, I think we were too busy just playing real games. There was no board games, it was, and then when I was, Ryan, they were playing, in the playroom, they were always going one-on-one of some variety. No, there was not a lot of sort of board game time, maybe some puzzles once in a while, but it was, I coached them in the boys club. It was one of the great, I coached them. Karen was the scorekeeper. The games would be over. The rides home were like beyond anything you could possibly imagine. Any suggestion, today about, how parents need to, address their kids and make sure that they, that they're not threatened in the car. Not only threatened, but it was sort of like, this is all, you got to do, if you're not going to play better, you're not going to play hard. If you're not going to do this, you're not going to do that. You can forget it. You're never going to be as good as you want to be, that kind of stuff. But which is interesting because it goes back to me growing up. There was never that kind of a conversation with my parents. I think generationally, my parents were from a generation that there was no hands-on involvement with their kids. There was just they did what they did, and we grew up and did what we did. And then, there was a very much more traditional, I think, my generation raising kids and your parents, there's much more involvement. And now it's sort of exploded exponentially in terms of, you guys. And, I see it obviously with Ryan and Corey and my grandkids, how everything's every day, every moment. I've got a series of texts today from Ryan who's got 3 kids home with the flu. And, it's like, I know every single day. I'm trying to think, my parents wouldn't even been a conversation like that, back in those days. But you touched on a couple of things. I don't know if you want me to get into a couple. You talked about the talent in the agency. You want me to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd love. Let's go there for sure. I'm also curious, like, in general, yeah, we were talented. Like, you guys were, people had to work hard. Like, I actually am curious to hear, how did you assess the differences between talent and someone with potential? Like, I look at even, this will run a couple weeks after the Super Bowl, but you look at someone like Jalen Hurt, right? Like, who it seems, now it's easy to talk about this now that he's got a win under his belt at the Super Bowl, but like, just keep chopping wood, keep getting better. But like, when you're looking at someone's book, like, you kind of know what the capacity for talent is. Did you look at both, like, this is talent that's pure versus I can develop this?
Yeah, I don't think it was either or. I think there's, and also different levels. But it's interesting. And I think part of it was the structure of the agency, the lack of hierarchy so it wasn't about who was going to be, quote, the top person, who was going to be, there was, because of the horizontal nature, the law firm analogy, it was always going to be about the right attitude. There's always been a lot of talent in the advertising business, tremendously talented people and interesting people. And very often, I think we felt that the biggest thing that held a lot of people back was actually the environment that they were working in, that didn't allow that talent. You heard enough stories where the best ideas actually never even get out of the agency. Why? Because the creative director was afraid. They didn't have the courage to, they couldn't approve. They were threatened by the idea. Whatever the variety of things are. And, we always, I guess because our names are on the door, we weren't necessarily threatened by anybody. And I think we made it clear. And, I've had this conversation with Tom Messner a number of times in the last year or so, because people always say, how did the agency become the way it was? And did you guys talk about, the kind of agency that you wanted to build? And did you have a mission? And, and the answer always was no, no, no. Like we were just open the doors. We wanted to survive. But there was just sort of this common understanding of the kind of environment we wanted to have. But again, it was unspoken. But the two things that were spoken that I think unwittingly actually played a tremendous role in developing the culture and in attracting certain kinds of people. One is the fact that everyone shared offices. And right from the beginning, Tom and Barry shared an office. Bob Schmetter and I shared an office. When we moved to 350 Hudson, Louise and I shared offices. And the truth is that was a combination of an economic reason. We felt it was absurd that people would have their own offices who were either on shoots half the time or with clients half the time. And the more people we could put into an office, the better the economics of running the business were. But it also was, was an industry of collaboration and sitting around and bullshitting with people. But I think the fact that the partners did that suggested that there was no excuse. So what that did was it took away one of the things that traditional agencies used to tell people how important they were, which is the size of their office. Okay. You have a corner office, you must be important because you have a corner office. And the second thing was no titles. We started out as, we were partners for legal reasons. I was the treasurer. I forgot Tom was the secretary. We just needed that for legal documents, but we operated as a management team. When Bob Schmetter joined us, we made him president because his name wasn't on the door the first year. We felt we needed something that designated him as clearly an important person there. But there were no executive vice presidents, no senior vice presidents, no vice presidents, nothing like that. They were all functioning titles. And then ultimately, was partner. It was managing director kinds of things. And in fact, the great story, I guess I'll mention it by name, but Paul Wolf, was a terrific writer, a little bit like a lot of creative people, a little bit insecure about himself, which he shouldn't have been because he was just a major talent who we actually wound up hiring twice. But anyway, the first time he was coming from Ammirati Purists, and we sort of negotiated, went back and forth. And he said, I really have to come. He said, what's my title going to be? Right, so we don't have any titles. And he said, well, but I'm a vice president, creative group head at Ammirati. I said, well, it's nice, but we don't have any titles. And he says, well, how are people going to know I'm a senior creative person? And I said, hopefully by the quality of the work you do. To his credit, he joined the agency. But that's the kind of answer that I'm sure when it got around, said, it increased the reputation of me as being a little bit
Right.
intimidating. But again, it cut through to, when I look, we had this lunch last summer with Smith and Walensky, and there's about 12, 13 of us. And I looked around, it was Tom, myself, and Joe O'Neill, and Tom Carroll, and Paul Wolf, and Michael Lee. And then, Jeff Kling was there for a while. Kevin Roddy was there for a while. Lorenzo DeRita, worked at, Nike in Europe. But I mean, the bench was just, I don't mean bench meaning that there were subs. It was the bench of the first team that because once people started to realize that there was no agency that actually once they bought into the partnership idea, there was no agency that actually gave them so much independence and so much freedom to do what they thought they were terrific at doing, which they were right. And that having that much talent there at various times over the years was just incredible. And the other thing that's interesting is this one we had, this lunch, there was a few people there who said there's a woman named Golnar I think she's like CEO of, do you know Golnar?
Of course. Yeah, she's crushing it.
Yeah, she's killing it. And she said, the 3 years I spent at the agency was the most rewarding, most enjoyable learning experience I've ever had in my career. And I go, that's kind of weird. The woman's running this major public company now, killing it. And that's what she said. And there's been a number of these.
Well, learning and leading, or when you're learning versus when you actually are leading, are very. I'm sure you feel that way too. But I will say the fact that you guys had clarity, like they weren't ever called commandments, but they kind of were. Like you kind of knew. I remember hearing about flat structure. Also, realistically, like my first job was coming in when I came in 04-ish, no, 98 at 98. My boss was Christina Love, and I had dotted lines into 22 partners. I mean, like I remember, so I have no free time. I am like, who needs me of the 22 partners, or like, how do we perfect putting together the exact right business development team who would be ready to take on whatever, project they were going to take on, whatever pitch they were going to take on. I say that because, and I'm thinking about the Paul Wolf story about how he has to make that leap. He has to be an entrepreneur and make that leap, and he's got to be okay with it. And it reminds me of the conversation you and I have had about the concept of courage in the past, where you used to say, I think this is like when the book came out and you reached back out, you said to me, Ryan, I always said the two most underutilized words in business were courage and no. And sometimes it takes courage to say no. This is a great example of that. And of course, maybe 5 years after, we had the same convo where you're like, it's so interesting that now the two most underutilized words in business are courage and yes. Like it's almost too easy to say no. Like you as a business leader, where should you stay curious and say yes? Do you still feel that people are not saying yes enough as they should?
Well, I think, and again, it's not as much firsthand knowledge as obviously it had at the time. I think the problem now, I mean, there may be a multitude of problems now, but I don't think they're saying yes or no. I think they're saying good meeting. We'll get back to you with feedback in 10 days, and then 10 days go by and they can't find anybody, and it's that kind of thing. I think that the courage to say no, that early one, that I referenced with you was more because I thought that the people in the advertising business were afraid to say no because they thought that a client would get upset if they said no. No, we can't have their work on Tuesday. We need more time. We'll have it on Friday. And as opposed to, we have to have it done because the client's going to be mad if we don't have it done on Tuesday. And again, that's a simplistic example, but again, it goes back to the idea of trust. I think that we were very fortunate in that we didn't get the trust, we earned the trust. And therefore, when I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea, or no, I don't think we should do that, or yes, I think that's a great idea, or yes, we can make this campaign better. Both of those, in a lot of ways, were, opposite sides of the same coin. They were an honest articulation in a business where there's not a lot of honest articulation. There's a lot of waffling and a lot of wavering and a lot of fear, even, going back 25, 30 years ago. So I remember, we were in a pitch for Jaguar, and, I think there was like semifinals. There were work sessions. I think they may have actually been out in Newport Beach. I think the headquarters were still in Laguna at the time. And we had gone through our, I think it was a strategic meeting. And at a certain point, the managing director, Jaguar, guy named Michael Driscoll, who I still know and still talk to, said, all the strategy stuff is great. He says, but I really think what we need is he's a British guy with I'm not doing the comment justice because it was done with a proper Britishness. And he said, I don't think what we need is just some great commercials, great advertising. I took a little pause and I said, well, I'm not actually sure that's what you need. And, there was sort of like this quiet in the room, and he looked and I said, I actually think what you need is what Jaguar needs is a strategy that defines itself, et cetera, out of which we'll do great advertising. And the meeting ended, and, about a month later, we had the final pitch. We wound up getting the business. And Mike, at the celebration dinner, said that when I said that to him in that meeting was the minute he knew we were going to get the account. He said, because he knew that if you had, in that situation, if this agency had, I don't know whether he used the word courage, but that's sort of what he meant, was going to have the courage to say that to me in that situation, then these are people that I knew were always going to do the best that they could and give us their best and most honest opinion. It bears out of the idea of having the courage to say what you believe, and whether what you believe is yes, and whether what you believe is no, or whatever, somewhere in between. There's too many people who don't have the courage of their own convictions, I guess, to borrow another cliche.
Ron, when I think about it's not even career at this point. It's like, look, you kind of audit your life, which this may not be a fun exercise, or maybe it is a fun exercise, right? But like, you navigate Brooklyn, you find sports, you break some records, some that I think still hold, by the way. You kind of get this track record for, if you put my mind to stuff, I'm going to be okay here. You grow one of the largest agencies in the world. You put a team together of other people. You think about what a lot of us have gone on to do. It's amazing to see, like, even like Carl Lieberman at Wieden+Kennedy now. Like, these guys are, it's so cool to see everybody sort of the seeds of we come from your tree. There, I'll use a football analogy. We're from the Belichick, the Ron Berger tree. But also, like, you've sat on a number of boards where you've been passionate about serving those boards. You got the documentary. You had a hand in, like, being one of the founding partners of Advertising Week. You've done a lot of really cool shit, frankly. When you think about when an idea comes to you, or it's like a feeling, and you've got to go do it, and you've done it. Now, when you think back, or when you think forward, like, I still want to do X, Y, or Z. Is there something else that you feel like I still want to do this? Right now, there's one other thing I want to do. It's this. Is there something else that comes to mind?
I think the answer is yes. Maybe not as, well, I was going to say not as profound as you might be thinking, but I think there have been ideas that I've had for certain things, things I think I should do or could do. But one of the things about as you get older and as you get further away from the day-to-day activity of the way business operates, you get much more protective, even more protective of your time and your willingness to waste time. And I've been involved in a few projects, one that went on for a couple of years where I was working with some friends who were in the comedy business, and they wanted to and I talked to them about taking the comedy brand and creating a digital platform around comedy. And, as obviously digital media exploded and all the things you could do with it. And the brand they have is an iconic comedy brand. And we spent, I can't tell you how many different conversations and how many different iterations. And it was something I got very involved with and, did a lot of work on and wrote, what the brand could be and what it could stand for. And, it was the kind of thinking that meetings through COVID, Zoom meetings every week with different people and investors. And ultimately the thing went nowhere. And I said, you know what, this is crazy. I said, because the only way it would have gone anywhere was if we decided to put the money up ourselves to do it. And I went back and realized that's actually what happened when we started the agency. If we had to go and start knocking on people's doors to raise money, who the hell knows what would have happened. But we had the courage to say, you know what, we think we can do this. Let's start the agency. So anyway, not to go back to that, but back to the question. The more, the one or two times that's happened, I did a project with a private equity company that was looking to, do a roll up of digital companies. And again, I went out, talked to hundreds of companies. This is a number of years ago. And what happens is the process, it reminds you of how when you don't have the final say in doing something and you're at even though as an agency person, obviously somebody else has to say yes. But the more time that is spent and the more times you realize how few people can say yes and how many can say no, or worse, can say nothing, you decide, I got better things to do with the time that I have. And as I get older and realize the time that I have is not as much as I used to have, I'm much more selfish in exposing myself to spending time on things where I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I don't need any kind of validation to say, oh, I'm working on this or I'm working on that. Now, having said that, one of the things that I'm thinking about as it relates to the agency is and it comes out of, a lot of things over the last couple of years where, like the lunches with Smith, we've sort of begun to have this MVBMS community where people are starting to express themselves and starting to talk about what it was like to work there, and then starting to think about the work that we did and how important it was. Thinking that I actually don't think the agency has ever gotten the acknowledgement for what it actually did. I think it's known for what it did, but I don't think it's actually gotten the industry-wide acknowledgement, or even beyond the industry. This, in fact, I talked to Michael Lee about it. He said one of the things about we never actually cared what the industry thought. We actually operated in a much larger universe. And so I was thinking about the idea of doing something that, whether it's a retrospective, whether it's some kind of, the body of work and that is put someplace where people can actually see and learn and understand a lot of what we're talking about, and obviously a lot of what others have talked about as it relates to the agency. So, but that's a project that, that at least I feel I can control. You know what I mean? I don't mean I can control. I know what has to happen and who to turn to for help in getting it done. And as opposed to going to people and saying, oh, we'd like to do this. Can you please let us do it? So, and I think knowing how people feel about the agency and the importance that it played in their lives and their careers, as you've talked about, I think it feels like if I could do something like that and it would bring people together, it could be an interesting thing. So that's I don't know whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's something I've been kicking around.
I love it. Yeah, again, it's not just, first of all, the work itself that came out of the building was special, but like to me as a neophyte there, like I was just getting lots of sunshine and water, but I don't think I really did anything exceptional there personally. I think I was surrounded by exceptional, and it gave me what I needed to know what exceptional was. And I know I'm not the only one that felt that way. So what I love about it is it would be, you know, I don't know what the ending of this story looks like, but if you go on the journey, there's a lot of people like me that took a standard into the business that impacted other work in other places, you know, which would be very interesting to look at and explore as well. I don't know if it's a doc, if it's a time capsule, but something good would come of it for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you got to sort of get I mean, here's an example of it. Yesterday morning, I'm watching CNBC at 8 o'clock, you know, Squawk Box in the morning, and a guy, CEO, is being interviewed, and they said, "What are you here for?" And he says, "Well, I'm ringing a bell on the Nasdaq. We've moved our company from the New York Stock Exchange to Nasdaq." And I looked up and I said to myself, "That's amazing." Now, I don't know if you know the story. So we created the Nasdaq stock market. Okay, there was no Nasdaq stock market. In 1994, a guy named Brian Holland, who I'd worked with at Scally McCabe, he was an account guy, went to what was called the OTC market, the over-the-counter market. And if you used to look at the New York Times stock pages, there was the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, and the OTC market. And it was a hierarchy of companies that, if they were small and upstart, they would start on the OTC, and then if they got big enough and grew enough, they would graduate to hopefully in their minds, the New York Stock Exchange, and they would then be part of the New York Stock, the Wall Street Club. Anyway, this Brian's idea was that we create a new, more contemporary stock market. We wound up calling it NASDAQ, which was actually NASDAQ stands for the National Association of Security Dealers Automatic Quotation System. Doesn't exactly roll off your tongue. But one of the interesting things was the early companies on NASDAQ, for the reasons I said earlier, were Apple, MCI, Ben & Jerry's, into companies that basically were new companies that were changing the way the world worked. And in many ways, couldn't see themselves being on the New York Stock Exchange. But on the other hand, the OTC market wasn't prestigious enough or prestigious at all. So we created the NASDAQ. I wrote the line, the stock market for the next 100 years. And we did this whole campaign about the new way stock markets will work, and then featured these companies and basically gave them free 30-second commercials as a value add for them being on the NASDAQ stock market. Anyway, now here we are, 2025. They obviously have opened up a place in Times Square because they needed their own physical place to match the New York, the stock exchange down on Wall Street. And the idea that a company would leave New York to go to the NASDAQ was unheard of. The idea, what we're trying to do is stem people leaving NASDAQ to go to the New York Stock Exchange. So with this guy, I looked up and I go, holy shit, this is such a, it's
a strategy.
Foundation of
Totally.
something people go, yeah, exactly. It may be the single best, most important thing we ever did as an agency. I mean, just think about it. With the story I just told you, and the strategic work around it was incredible. About not trying to climb the same ladder of the New York Stock Exchange, but to create your own ladder, and don't worry about being part of the old boy network. Create your own club. And if you look at the company, and every one of those companies is still on NASDAQ. Apple, well, obviously not MCR, but they were all the new generation of companies. Don't even think about, going to the New York Stock Exchange. They want to be on NASDAQ, and there was no NASDAQ. We created that. I wrote the line, the stock market for the next 100 years. That campaign alone could be taught in business schools for decades.
Well, I mean, two immediate thoughts come to mind, and this is a great place to wrap. One, I mean, that is a CBI. If I've ever heard one, there it is.
100%.
What could be more a creative business idea than that? And two, I am definitely not making the documentary. I am clearly not making the cut. That's okay. I'll just see if I can be at the party, the watch party. That's cool too. Ron, take us home, man. It's you think about creativity, you think about courage. I mean, even your comment about the waffling or the ambiguity, like I've definitely said, if you don't know what you stand for, you never know when to take a stand. And it's like, it feels like we still deeply need that from our leaders. The amount of time we'll save, the amount of, hey, conviction we should have, and also showing leadership to others. How do you feel we should wrap this episode?
Well, two things. One is, I think a big part of understanding who you are or what a brand is also understanding what it isn't. And I think a lot of times, brands, try to like tiptoe around that clarity. I think New Balance, I was thinking of brands that have great clarity. New Balance was a client of ours for a number of years, and they never wanted to be Nike. They never tried to be Nike. They never tried to be, but they were clear on who they were and equally clear on who they weren't. And that has served them unbelievably well over the last 25. Been now, one of the hottest footwear, fashion brands in the world. So, I think that's sort of one thing that it goes back to the courage to really understand and believe what you are as a person, as well as who you are as a brand or as a company, and just as important what you aren't and who you aren't, and don't try to be something you're not if you're not comfortable doing that. And then the second, which is going back to the sports thing, which I've enjoyed this Knicks season incredibly, just the way they play and the teamwork, etc. But there's an expression that Tom Thibodeau uses. Josh Hart has become sort of this incredible talent of Swiss Army knife kind of player. He scores 30 points last night, 14 rebounds and 6. And I couldn't tell you any basket that he actually scored. He's just all over the place. And the expression that Thibodeau uses was two. One is the magic is in the work. When people think about, how does a player get to be a certain way? It's because they work. The magic happens when you do the work. But the larger one, and it goes back to the conversation we used to have about courage brands winning, is the expression impact winning. And whether it's in an organization, if you're on a team, there's a line, be a star in your role, but do something that impacts winning. Everyone isn't going to be the high scorer. Everyone isn't going to be the leading rebounder. Everyone isn't going to be the winner of all the awards or the CBI awards or whatever. But if you're part of the team, impact winning, however winning is defined in the situation that you're in. So those are the, whoever, does anyone can take away from this, to me, those are the things that I sort of think about today. And, I pass on to, my grandkids and stuff like that about if they're competing. Just don't worry about how many shots you make. Don't worry about how many shots you miss. Think about how to impact winning.
Ron, I'll thank you for always being a champion of the work that I'm doing. I appreciate you. I know you definitely had the under on when I'd bring up the Jets. We're way over an hour. All right, I'm not going to touch it. Okay, we talked about the Knicks being great. That's all.
They've already made a smart decision by moving on from the quarterback. But I think I texted you. I am not reading or discussing anything about the Jets until the first game starts. I told Ryan this, but my same thing. I said, don't send me any articles. Don't send me anything about the press. I don't care. Okay, I literally don't care. I'm enjoying the Knicks too much. I'm enjoying St. John's now. We got two great basketball stories in New York, and that's going to keep me busy through the winter.
Another reason why I wasn't going to bring it up, the spiral, courage brands winning. Let's stay on that path. Thanks, Ron. Appreciate you, man. Great to see you. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Courageous Podcast. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts so more people can find us. See you again next week.